So, on our first lesson on the brain, the topic of the brain, we were mainly looking at the peripheral structures that surround the brain, things like the dura mater and the unique organization of that structure. We also looked at the production and flow of CSF around the brain. In lesson two, what you see here, we're going to be focusing on the actual brain matter itself now. So what you see on this second slide is basically the major components of the human brain. So we have four distinct components that comprise the brain. They include the brainstem, the cerebellum, diencephalon, and cerebrum, which is sometimes referred to as the teleencephalon. Now, with the brainstem, this will make more sense when you start to look at the brain models in the videos and simulation, as I'm going to show you for the lab component. But our brainstem is basically the inferior-most part of the brain. It connects directly to the spinal cord and is responsible for receiving essentially all of the nerve impulses that are coming up the spinal cord and also down the brain into the spinal cord. So there are three distinct structures that form our brainstem, and we're going to look at those structures in more detail today. With the cerebellum, this is sometimes referred to as the little brain because of the fact that it's the second largest component of the brain, and compared to the brainstem, it's superior to the brainstem, but then posterior to the cerebrum. Whereas with the diencephalon, you might see this word and see the term die and think two, but that's actually not the case. There's actually four distinct structures that form the diencephalon. And those include the thalamus, the epithalamus, the subthalamus, and the hypothalamus. And we're going to look at least three of these structures today and learn about basically what functions they control in the body. And then finally, with the cerebrum, this is the most superior component of the brain. If you've ever looked at the human brain before in pictures, or if you've seen it in movies or some other source, oftentimes what you're just seeing is the cerebrum. It's the wrinkled part of the brain that has all of these folds associated with it. So it's the largest component of the brain. It's also the most highly evolved. So most of our kind of higher order processing, neuroanatomists call them executive functions. So these executive functions are basically things that we probably take for granted, but requires a lot of processing inside of the cerebrum. So the executive functions include things like your ability to, for instance, listen and appreciate music, or see a work of art and be able to derive meaning from that. There's other things like being able to plan out your day. You might be thinking, what am I going to be doing after I listen to this lecture? I'm going to go have a snack. I'm going to go out for a walk. Your ability to think ahead and plan out your activities is dependent on the cerebrum. So there's a lot more that the cerebrum controls than just that, but that's some examples of executive functions. So that's the four major components of the brain. And what we're going to start looking at first in this lesson is the brain stem. So as I mentioned, there are three distinct components of our brain stem, which you see highlighted here. Now, just inferior to the medulla oblongata is going to be the spinal cord, which you see that's not colored here. So the spinal cord leads directly into the medulla oblongata. From the medulla, this goes into the pons and then finally up into the midbrain. So we're going to focus on each one of these structures in a little more detail, starting with the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is going to be responsible for basically controlling a lot of vital life processes associated with our everyday lives. So there are these structures found not only in the medulla oblongata, but also within other parts of the brain that are called nuclei. So when you see this term nuclei, probably your first reference point is the organelle that is found within cells in our body, which contains DNA. And that's not the type of nuclei that we're referring to when we look at neuroanatomy. So for neuroanatomy, a nuclei or a nucleus is basically a group of neurons that perform a similar function. So within the medulla oblongata, there are going to be several nuclei that help control vital life processes associated with normal functioning of our body. Now, you see three distinct nuclei or vital centers within the medulla oblongata. First and foremost, we have the cardiovascular center. So this is related to controlling aspects of our heart. So the medulla is going to be important for controlling heart rate and also the force of heart contraction. Now, I just want to backpedal a little bit here and let everyone know that the nervous system is not required for producing the heartbeat. In fact, the heart itself is able to produce the heartbeat on its own. And as it turns out, if we didn't have any input from the nervous system at all, we would have a resting heart rate of about 120 beats per minute, which may or may not sound very fast to you, but that's pretty fast for a resting heart rate. So the medulla oblongata is going to use the cardiovascular center to help slow down our resting heart rate. It's like putting the brakes on our heart rate on an almost constant basis. It isn't until that we actually start doing some vigorous physical activity that the cardiovascular center basically lets off and allows the heart rate to climb and become higher. So the cardiovascular center is going to be there for adjusting heart rate to either speed it up or slow it down, and also to adjust the force of heart contraction. And what I mean by that is how strongly does the heart beat? So a more forceful heart contraction is going to allow more blood to be pumped out of the heart. Conversely, a less forceful heart contraction is going to allow less blood to come out of the heart. So heart rate and the force of heart contraction play an important role in what is called cardiac output. And that's something you'll learn a lot about in physiology, Bio 211, if and when you take that course. The second major nuclei that are found within the medulla is called the respiratory rhythmicity center. And this basically does exactly what the name implies. It basically regulates the rate of respiration. So we can either speed up or slow down our breathing rate through the use of these neurons that are found inside of this nucleus. And then finally, believe it or not, we even have nuclei dedicated to controlling these bodily processes, including vomiting. The medical term for that is emesis, coughing, and also sneezing. All of these are regulated. They're all reflexes in nature, and they're basically initiated in this part of our brainstem. So another really interesting aspect of the medulla oblongata is this structure that you see here called the decussation of pyramids. So decussation, that sounds like a fancy word. That's an anatomical term for crossing over. So literally what is happening at the level of the medulla oblongata here is that neurons that are moving up the spinal cord cross over from the left side to the right side of the brain. So from the left side of your body, they're going to cross over and go to the right side of your brain. Conversely, we're going to have groups of neurons coming up from the right side of your body, cross over, and come over to the left side of the brain here. So the decussation of pyramids basically describes that crossing over of neurons that occurs there. So you might be familiar with this concept because you may know that the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. And the anatomical reason why that happens is because of this structure indicated here. So for those of you that are right-handed, for instance, you're predominantly relying on your left brain for control of that upper extremity. So neuroanatomists aren't quite sure why this happens, this crossing over. No one really knows a good explanation for why we have neurons that cross from one side of the body to the opposite hemisphere of the brain. We still aren't sure what the purpose of that is. So just above, superior to the medulla oblongata, is going to be another major component of the brainstem called the pons. So the pons has this very distinctive structure that you see here. It plays some similar roles in our body to what the medulla does. So within the pons, there is a set of nuclei called the pontine respiratory group. And we rely on these nuclei to basically regulate certain aspects of breathing. In particular, we rely on these neurons to switch from quiet breathing to labored breathing. So quiet breathing is something you rely on when you're not really doing anything very physically demanding. So as you listen to this lesson, for instance, you're most likely using quiet breathing to basically accommodate your oxygen demands in your body. But the moment, let's say, you get up from this lesson and you go to take a jog around the block, you're going to have to switch to more labored, more forced breathing to accommodate the increased oxygen demands that your body requires. So the pons is going to be important for that switchover from quiet breathing to more labored breathing and the muscles that are needed to control that. So that's the pons. And then immediately superior to the pons, we have the last major structure of the brainstem called the midbrain. Some anatomists will call this the mesencephalon. So within the midbrain, there are actually many different types of nuclei. And I just want to spend a few moments talking about some of the different types of nuclei that are found here, because there are a lot of them that are very